Frontier. Welcome, weary traveller, to this quiet nook of the past. Before we set off on our journey into the freezing heart of medieval winters, allow me to offer a warm greeting to you, dear listener. Whether you're curled up beneath a cozy blanket, preparing to drift into sleep, or simply seeking calm in a restless world, I'm honored you've chosen to join me tonight. And if you feel inclined, I'd love to know where you're listening from. What country? What time of day? Leave a comment below. It's always a joy to see the wide and wonderful tapestry of fellow history lovers who gather here. And if you find comfort in these gentle stories from the past, consider subscribing so you never miss another quiet adventure into time. But for now, let the noise of modern life soften and fade as we travel back, far back, to an age when winter meant more than inconvenience. It meant danger. It meant survival. Let your imagination carry you to a countryside blanketed in frost, where the air bites, the sky broods, and the snow whispers through naked branches. Imagine medieval Europe in the final days of autumn. The trees stand bare, skeletal against a pale sky. The sun hangs low and distant, offering little warmth, its rays diluted by thick, leaden clouds. The fields crunch beneath your feet, already hardened by early frost. The first flurries dance through the air on a chill wind. And so begins winter, a season of hardship, of scarcity, of fear. The cold creeps in slowly, but once it takes hold, it settles deep and lingers long. Rivers harden into glistening slabs of ice. Ponds vanish beneath white stillness. Without the benefit of central heating, thick insulation, or modern comforts, warmth was a rare and fleeting thing, reserved only for the wealthy, and even then, only barely. Yet, it wasn't always so grim. Centuries earlier, the climate followed a more forgiving rhythm. The seasons turned gently. Winter, while difficult, was expected and manageable. But change came, a shift in the air, the temperature, the world itself. What followed became known as the Little Ice Age. Beginning around the 14th century and stretching into the 19th, this climatic downturn plunged Europe into colder, crueler winters. The causes remain uncertain. Volcanic eruptions, solar activity, ocean currents, all possible culprits. But the effects were undeniable. Crops withered, animals froze, hunger spread, and the cold settled deeper each year. One of the most chilling winters of this era was the Great Frost of 1709. Temperatures dropped so low that rivers and lakes froze solid across Europe. In London, the Thames became a frozen plain, dotted with market stalls and bonfires set up directly on the ice. It was a strange, eerie sight, a carnival on a glacier. But for all its novelty, it brought tragedy. Thousands died in their homes, unable to keep warm. The world outside transformed into a white, silent grave. Yet even amid the ice, some found a spark of unexpected inspiration. A young Isaac Newton, then a student at Cambridge, returned home during the Great Frost. There, tucked beside his family hearth, with little else to distract him, he pondered the nature of light and numbers. It was in this enforced stillness that Newton began shaping ideas that would change the world. Calculus, optics, the laws of motion. Perhaps it was the cold that sharpened his mind, or perhaps in the hush of a frozen world, thought could finally take root. It's a small, comforting reminder. Even in the deepest cold, the human mind still burns with fire. But for most people, there was little time for contemplation. Winter was not a muse, it was a menace. The wealthy had woolen cloaks, crackling hearths, and storerooms stocked with smoked meats and salted fish. But the poor, the peasants, the serfs, the labourers, faced a very different reality. Picture a family rising before dawn in a one-room cottage. The air inside is thick with wood smoke, yet still your breath frosts before your face. The fire, little more than embers, is coaxed back to life with trembling hands. The straw bedding is cold, the walls thin and draughty. Every crevice breathes winter into the room. Breakfast, if any, is modest. A crust of stale bread, a spoonful of porridge. The harvest stores are already dwindling, and the bitterest months have yet to come. Outside, the animals huddle in the barn, if you're lucky enough to have one. Their coats frostbitten, their breath steaming in the icy air. You wrap yourself in every layer you own and step into the snow to gather what wood you can find. Your hands crack, bleed, and burn with cold. But without fire, there is no survival. You think of your children, their cheeks red with wind, their eyes wide with hunger. You think of your elders, too frail to move from their beds, and so you press on. This was daily life, a constant exhausting war against winter. And yet, even then, there were moments of grace. The medieval world moved in step with the seasons. Nature wasn't just background, it was the very fabric of life. And so, as the snow fell, so too did traditions unfold. Rituals born of rhythm and repetition, of resilience and hope. One such moment of light came in the form of the Feast of St. Stephen, celebrated on December 26th. On this day, the social order relaxed, if only for a moment. A commoner might be crowned the Lord of Misrule, presiding over a rowdy celebration of food, laughter, and music. It was a temporary reversal, but it offered rare delight, a moment of levity and liberation in a world often bound by duty and class. Even more important, then the feast was what it represented, the value of community. Survival in winter was rarely a solo act. Families relied on neighbors, villages leaned inward, a pot of stew shared, an extra log given, a knock at the door just to ask, "Are you all right?" The fire in the hearth was often kept burning not with wood, but with kindness. Imagine a village cloaked in snow, chimney smoke curling into a grey sky. Inside, families sit close, swapping stories, warming hands, sharing whatever scraps remain. Faces are weary, but not defeated. Eyes tired, but still bright with the knowledge that they've endured before, and they will again. The snow piles higher, the rivers thicken with ice, but there is always that faint shimmer on the horizon, the belief that spring will come. And so they watched for signs, the days growing longer by a breath, the earth softening beneath the frost, the return of birdsong, timid but sure. When the thaw began, it was cause for joy, for reverence, for thanksgiving. The first Monday after Epiphany was Plough Monday, a day to bless the ploughs, to turn the soil, to begin again. The earth, once frozen and still, was now ready. The furrows, once impossible, opened wide to receive the seed. There was hardship, yes, hunger, sickness, sorrow. But through it all, the people of the medieval world endured. They endured because they believed in spring, in the cycle of seasons, in one another. And perhaps in our own way, so do we. As winter deepened and the days grew shorter, the darkness settled like a blanket over the medieval world. With the sun setting in the mid-afternoon and not returning until late morning, people lived more hours in darkness than in light. And in that darkness, both fear and imagination thrived. Candles and lanterns were luxuries. For many peasants, light came only from the hearth or a tallow dip, a crude, smoking lump of fat with a makeshift wick. These flickering flames cast more shadow than glow. Whole households would huddle near the fire, not only for warmth but for company, for safety, for comfort in the flickering silence. Nighttime was when the world changed. Outside, the cold sharpened. Winds howled through forests and down alleys like the cries of spirits. Trees groaned under the weight of snow. Roofs cracked, walls creaked. A fox's scream in the woods might echo like a soul in torment. In such a setting, folklore came alive. This was the season of ghosts. Winter, with its quiet and stillness, made space for stories. Around fires, families passed down tales of wandering souls, lost travelers, and beings that moved through the snow unseen. They told of the wild hunt, a spectral cavalcade of riders thundering through the sky, searching for the restless dead. To hear the hunt was to receive a warning. To see it meant death. Other stories told of household spirits, some kind, some cruel. The tomt in the Scandinavian north, or the brownies of Britain, who helped with chores if treated well, but played wicked tricks if offended. Offerings of bread, milk, or a warm scarf left near the hearth might appease them. These legends weren't just entertainment. They were tools, ways to explain the unexplainable. Why milk spoiled, why animals grew restless, why illness came in the night. The darkness hid many things, not just folklore, but real dangers too. With fewer hours of daylight, work became compressed. Tasks that required daylight, splitting wood, gathering water, tending to animals, had to be done quickly, often in dangerous conditions. Slipping on ice, cutting a hand, falling through a frozen stream, all could prove fatal. And so many tasks moved indoors, spinning, weaving, mending, carving. Long winter evenings were filled with quiet, repetitive labor. Children helped where they could. Grandparents told stories to keep small hands occupied. Women spun wool into thread using drop spindles or primitive wheels. They repaired worn clothing, patched holes, and prepared flax for weaving. Men carved handles, mended tools, or braided rope. These weren't idle activities. They were survival. Because when the freeze eased and spring returned, life would demand everything again. Some communities used the winter months to plan, to take stock, to barter what little they had. Winter markets became moments of exchange and contact. Furs, salt, dried herbs, and homemade goods were traded, sometimes for coin, but more often for goods in kind. These gatherings were more than economic. They were moments of connection in a season of isolation, a chance to hear news, to see faces beyond one's family, to remember that the village still lived. Religious festivals offered other chances for cheer. Candlemas in early February was a pivotal moment, halfway between the solstice and the equinox. It marked a turning point in the winter, a symbolic gesture toward the coming spring. Candles were blessed, processions held. It was a moment of hope wrapped in ritual, but even these ceremonies held a quiet desperation. Winter was not linear. A thaw might come, only to be followed by weeks of renewed snow and biting winds. February could be crueler than January. March, too. The frost didn't follow calendars, and the longer it lingered, the more the hunger grew. Food preservation was both science and art. Salting, smoking, pickling, drying. Each method extended the life of precious provisions. Meat hung from rafters, fish buried in barrels of brine, root vegetables stored in earthen cellars. but all of it was finite, and poorly stored food often rotted or froze beyond use. Hunger was a constant companion. By February, most families lived on the edge of starvation. The salted meat was gone. The bread, baked from the last of the grain, grew hard and blackened. Porridge thinned to the consistency of soup. Children cried more. The old grew quiet. Some foraged through snowdrifts for bitter greens or bulbs. Others boiled bark or leather, scraping whatever nutrients they could find. Entire regions knew the taste of famine, and when disease came, it moved swiftly. Weakened bodies could not fight infection. Colds turned into pneumonia. Cuts became sepsis. Skin cracked and invited fever. The very breath of others could carry death. In cramped huts with no airflow, illness moved like a shadow. There was little help to be found. Healers did what they could, mixing herbs, burning rosemary or sage, wrapping limbs in cloth soaked with vinegar or wine. Priests offered prayers, but few cures existed. The sick were tended by those who loved them, and who often followed them into the grave. And still, people endured. They endured because endurance was all they had. And in the stillness of that endurance, something strange happened. Beauty remained. The frost on the window pane etched filigrees more delicate than any hand could draw. Icicles caught the light like chandeliers. The hush of falling snow muted the world into a lullaby. Even the coldest nights had stars, brighter and nearer, as if the sky leaned closer to the earth. Winter did not just take, it also stilled, it softened, it clarified. It taught patience, it forced presence, it made every act, of care, of creation, of kindness, stand out more clearly, like footprints in snow. One such act might be a hand reaching out in darkness, a child sharing the last bite of bread, a neighbor bringing wood when yours runs low, a song hummed while stitching a torn sleeve. These were not grand gestures, but, in a season of survival, they were everything. And perhaps that is the truth of winter. It is not just a test of strength, but of gentleness. A measure of what we cling to when the world gives nothing. A reminder that warmth, when it cannot come from fire, must come from each other. So, even in the medieval world, harsh and unforgiving as it was, people laughed. They told stories. They danced in candlelight. They carved small gifts. They waited. They believed. They lived. 703.103. As winter wore on, not only bodies but buildings were tested. The medieval home, humble and handmade, was no match for months of snow, sleet, and wind. Walls built of wattle and daub, woven sticks smeared with mud and straw, cracked under the pressure of freeze and thaw. Thatched roofs grew heavy with ice, chimneys smoked poorly, and the floors, often just packed earth, turned cold as stone. Even in noble households, discomfort was constant. Castles were draughty, their stone walls impossible to heat fully. Tapestries hung on the walls not just for beauty, but for insulation. Rushes were spread across floors to absorb cold and spills, though these became nests for lice and other pests. Fires burned in open hearths, but much of the warmth rose into the rafters or out through narrow windows. People slept close together, not always out of affection, but necessity. Body heat was the cheapest and most reliable source of warmth. Parents huddled with children, servants with masters, everyone wrapped in layers of wool and furs. In many places, livestock shared living space with humans. Pigs in the corner, chickens roosting near the door, cows behind a low wall. Their warmth helped, and their presence was practical. If an animal fell ill or froze, it could mean ruin for the family. The line between indoors and outdoors was thinner than we might imagine. Doors were warped, windows were unglazed or covered with animal skins. Drafts slipped through every crack. The idea of warmth was relative. It meant not shivering uncontrollably, not watching your breath mist inside the room. At night, the dark returned with a kind of weight. There was little to do but wait for morning. Entertainment, if any, was homemade. Songs, riddles, or tales passed from mouth to mouth. These were the hours when family lore was kept alive, when myth and memory mingled. One story told in the Scottish Highlands spoke of a girl who lit a single candle each night and sang to it, believing it would protect her from the long winter. Her neighbors laughed, but her fire never went out, even when others froze. They began to leave offerings at her door, bread, wool, dried herbs, hoping to share in her light. Such stories weren't mere diversions. They offered comfort, continuity. In a season that seemed to erase the world, they were proof that something remained. But for all the closeness winter demanded, it could also be deeply isolating. Remote farms became unreachable. Roads turned to icy traps. Forest paths vanished beneath snow. Communication slowed to a crawl. Illness or injury could mean weeks without help. Even childbirth, already dangerous, became more perilous if a midwife couldn't reach the house in time. And so, people prepared. Winter stores were gathered with careful calculation. Salted meat, pickled vegetables, jars of honey, sacks of barley or oats. Herbs hung from rafters to dry. Firewood was chopped in great stacks, though for the poor this often meant scavenging fallen branches, or burning peat, dried dung, or whatever scraps they could find. Shoes were repaired, Clothes patched, tools sharpened, everything made ready, as if for a siege. Because winter in many ways was a siege, a silent, relentless assault on body and mind. The church calendar helped mark the passing time. Advent, Christmas, Epiphany, Candlemas. Each observance gave rhythm to the stillness. Lent followed soon after, bringing fasting that for many was simply an extension of what hunger had already begun. But not all was bleak. Winter offered its own kind of magic, frozen lakes that shimmered like glass, snowflakes caught in woolen mittens, the hush of a village blanketed in white. Moments of laughter too, children sliding on ice, couples stealing kisses near the hearth, neighbors singing together over mugs of warm ale. One tradition in Eastern Europe involved lighting a fire on the village green on the last night of winter. People would gather, dance, toss dried herbs into the flames, and whisper the burdens they hoped to leave behind. As the fire burned, the smoke carried those sorrows away, clearing space for the spring to come. These rituals, large and small, reminded people that winter would end, and when it did, the world returned with startling beauty. Snow gave way to buds, trees once brittle bloomed green, rivers flowed again, and people stepped from their homes as if waking from a long sleep, blinking, stretching, breathing deeply. The first market day after winter was cause for celebration. Stalls reopened, goods exchanged, news shared, faces not seen in months lit up with recognition. Children played openly, musicians returned to corners and steps, life resumed, but it resumed with memory. Winter left its mark, in thin bodies, in empty cupboards, in names missing from the roll. Graves were dug in frozen ground with axes and prayer. Some years the soil never thawed, and the dead were kept in barns or sheds until spring. Funerals delayed, mourning suspended. The ground itself could not let go. And yet life continued. It always did, and perhaps that's the deeper truth. Buried in the brutality of winter, not that it was cold or cruel or endless, but that people kept going anyway. They survived, not in spite of the season, but within it. They adapted, they shared. They remembered what mattered most, not wealth, not conquest, but warmth, care, presence. That a loaf of bread could be a gift, that a neighbor's knock could be salvation, that even in the darkest, snowiest, most frozen corners of history, light still flickered, and so it does now. No 3.104. In the quiet of winter, time slowed. Not because there was less to do, but because the world itself moved more slowly. The snow muffled footsteps, the cold froze motion, even thought sometimes seemed to stretch out in the stillness. It was in these long hours that reflection took root. Beneath layers of wool and silence, people thought, not just of survival, but of meaning. The medieval worldview was steeped in faith. The church shaped every season, every hardship. Winter was no exception. Sermons spoke of suffering as a pathway to grace, the frost a metaphor for spiritual testing, the dark a mirror for doubt, the spring to come a promise of redemption. Many found comfort in this, the idea that their pain was not wasted, but woven into something greater, that their endurance was seen, even if not by neighbors, then by God. Chaplains traveled village to village, offering prayers, last rites, and encouragement. They were not always learned, not always kind, but they were present, and presence mattered. In monasteries, monks kept vigil, reciting psalms through the night, their voices rising with the smoke from oil lamps. They prayed for the sick, the starving, the dying. They copied texts by candlelight, preserving not only scripture but knowledge, herbal remedies, histories, the stars. One monk, Brother Elric, wrote in his margins during a particularly harsh winter, "The snow piles against the door, the ink freezes in its pot, but still I write, for even cold must be remembered." That line survives, scratched into parchment now held in a quiet library. The world that froze around him has melted, but his words remain. In a way, that is what all of us do. Leave traces, marks of presence, a child's handprint in frost, a song sung softly in the dark, a story whispered beside a flame. These are footprints through the cold, and they matter. Even today, with our insulated walls and electric light, winter holds echoes of the past. We light candles not because we must, but because it feels right. We gather around fireplaces, we share warm drinks, we tell old tales. Something in us remembers the necessity of closeness. The cold draws us together, and in that closeness something stirs, a tenderness that summer forgets. Perhaps that's why so many of our holidays fall in winter. Why we bring light into the dark, why we gather, feast, sing. It's not just tradition, it's instinct, a memory written in our bones of how to survive the long night, with warmth, with stories, with one another. And if we look closely, we see it everywhere. In a parent placing an extra blanket on a child, in neighbors checking in after a storm, in soup kitchens, coat drives, firewood stacked on porches. The medieval world was not so different. The tools were rougher, the beliefs stricter, but the hearts, they were very much like ours. They grieved as we grieve, they hoped as we hope, and they rested when they could. Rest, after all, was rare. The demands of daily life did not stop with the cold. Livestock still needed tending, bread still needed baking, wood still needed chopping. But when all was done, when the last ember glowed and the wind howled outside, rest came. It came in deep breaths, in shared silence, in sleep. Sleep in the medieval winter was segmented. Without artificial light, people often went to bed shortly after dark, but they didn't sleep straight through. Instead, they rose in the night, for prayer, for thought, for a moment of stillness. Then they returned to bed. This first sleep and second sleep was common, and in between there was time for whispering, for dreaming, for listening to the night. Maybe we've lost something in sleeping all at once. Maybe the pause between dreams held wisdom. But no matter how they slept, people woke to the same world, cold, quiet, waiting. And day after day, they met it, not with fanfare, not with grand acts, but with persistence, with repetition, with care, a woman rising to start the fire, a man mending his child's boots, a grandmother teaching her granddaughter to spin, a boy feeding the chickens before his hands go numb. These were the rituals of resistance, of remembrance, and they are still ours, for though we no longer live in medieval huts, though our winters are warmed by thermostats and softened by fleece, we still feel that chill, that slow, creeping quiet that asks us to pause, to reflect, and maybe, if we listen, it speaks of simplicity, of endurance, of the gentle, stubborn will to go on. So, tonight, as the wind taps at your window and the world outside turns pale and still, know this. You walk in ancient footsteps. Your breath clouds the air just as theirs did. Your search for warmth, for meaning, for rest. It is the same story, told in new ways, and as you drift towards sleep, think not just of the cold, but of the hands that braved it before you. They stir the coals beside you. They hum lullabies beneath the wind. They remind you that winter may be long, but it always, always ends. tSurvive 3.5. By now, you may be feeling the pull of sleep, the way it settles in, soft and slow, like the snow once settled across the fields of medieval Europe. And that's fitting, because winter, perhaps more than any other season, invites rest, deep, necessary rest. But before we close our eyes completely, let's visit one last scene, the chapel in winter. It's small, built from stone, warmed by candlelight and breath. Inside, a few villagers gather, not for grand sermons or displays of wealth, but for warmth of spirit. A psalm is sung, a prayer is whispered. Children fidget on benches while old men lean on canes carved long ago. The priest's robes are worn, his voice is raspy, but he speaks not of judgment, but of hope. He speaks of light returning, of the promise that no season, no sorrow, lasts forever. And the people listen, not because they're devout in the way we might imagine, but because they need something to believe in, something steady, something enduring. Outside, the wind howls through the graveyard, the trees moan beneath frost, but inside, there is warmth, not from fire alone, but from closeness, from ritual, from words passed down like heirlooms. Afterward, they step into the cold again, but the cold feels different, not kinder perhaps, but less final. They've remembered spring will come. The medieval world was built on that kind of remembering. It wasn't just knowledge passed in books, it was memory woven into habit, into the way bread was baked, or how herbs were tied together, or how prayers were said over seeds before planting. It was in the way people faced hardship, not with complaint, but with rhythm, with ritual, and we, though centuries removed, carry that inheritance. We light candles when storms approach. We gather close when the nights are long. We make soup. We tell stories. We hold one another. These are not accidents. These are echoes. Echoes of a time when survival depended not only on tools, but on tenderness. When a woolen scarf was as important as a sword. When a loaf of bread was sacred. And as we trace these echoes, we find that the brutal winter wasn't only something to endure. It was something that revealed who we were when comfort disappeared, revealed what we valued when luxury was stripped away, revealed in silence and cold the glowing ember of care. In some monasteries, monks would gather before dawn, long before light returned to the land. They walked to the chapel in silence, breath rising in clouds, feet crunching snow, and when they reached the altar they sang, not to defy the winter, but to meet it, to say, even now, we lift our voices. That is the spirit of every person who has ever faced a long, hard season and still found something to give. The mother who divides a meager meal between her children. The father who rises early to mend the roof, again. The elder who teaches the child how to wrap a cloak just right. The neighbor who leaves firewood on your doorstep and walks away without a word. These are not stories from the past. They are stories from this week, this moment, this breath. Because winter, brutal as it is, continues to visit us. Not always as snow and ice, but as hardship, as waiting, as silence. And so the wisdom of those who came before still matters. They remind us how to endure, how to soften what cannot be changed, how to light a fire in more than just the hearth, and how to rest when the time comes, not in defeat, but in trust. Trust that the world will keep turning, that warmth will return, that what we do, quietly and faithfully, matters. So now, if your eyes grow heavy, let them close. Let the images linger. A single candle in a frostbitten window, a child curled in a blanket, cheeks flushed from cold, a pot bubbling on a stone hearth, a hand reaching, gently, to tuck in the edge of a sleeve. This is how winter is endured, not through might, but through moments, through memory, through love. 3106. And now, as the hush of winter deepens and your body begins to settle into stillness, we pause, not to end the journey, but to take a breath before continuing. For though we've wandered far already through the frost-laced paths of the medieval world, there are still quiet corners to explore and deeper truths to uncover. You've travelled through cottages and chapels, listened to prayers rise with chimney smoke, watched hands work quietly in the dark. You've seen the cold and felt the warmth people built in spite of it. But winter was not only hardship, it was a way of life that shaped how people understood time, community, and even themselves. In that long season of stillness, people didn't simply wait for spring, they prepared, they observed, they passed on wisdom through work, through songs, through silence. There were lessons in every hour if one knew how to look for them. Let's stay with that thought for a moment. The idea that winter teaches, not loudly, not quickly, but gently, patiently. In the shortening days and lengthening nights, the rhythms of life slowed enough for reflection. The urgency of harvest passed, the roar of market days quieted. What remained was repetition, routine, and in that, a kind of sacredness. Many medieval thinkers, both in monasteries and beyond, saw winter not as a punishment, but as a spiritual teacher. The monks of Cluny wrote of the grace of snow, how it covered even the poorest hut and the richest chapel alike, reminding all of their shared frailty. The frost, they said, was a kind of parchment on which the divine wrote lessons in white. To live through winter was to read those lessons day by day. They spoke of the importance of tending not only the fire, but the soul, of gathering not only wood, but compassion, of watching the sky not only for weather, but for meaning. Outside the walls of abbeys, ordinary people practiced their own form of winter wisdom. Elders became storytellers, not just of legends, but of lived memory, of how to preserve beets in clay, how to layer wool for warmth, how to listen to the trees for signs of coming thaw. Knowledge was not written, it was lived, handed down in gestures, in recipes, in quiet corrections at the spinning wheel. These weren't grand teachings, but they endured far longer than many sermons. This too was a kind of survival, cultural, generational, spiritual. And as we move forward deeper into the frozen months, we'll see how this quiet transfer of knowledge carried whole communities through the most bitter years, through plague, through famine, through war. Because winter didn't pause for crisis. If anything, it sharpened every edge. In the segments ahead, we'll step into those harder winters, when sickness came with the snow, when war reached even the smallest hamlet, when grief settled heavier than the frost. We'll meet those who worked through mourning, who found hope in hunger, who stitched beauty even into rags, and we'll discover how winter not only exposed the fragility of life, but revealed the strength hidden beneath it. So take another breath. Let the fire in your imagination burn gently. Let your body sink deeper into rest. We're not at the end yet, but we're close, and what lies ahead may be colder, yes, but also brighter. Because in the stories still waiting to be told, you'll find what winter always gives to those who endure it: clarity, courage, and eventually, light. There were winters when the cold did more than bite. It shattered. When snow did more than fall, it suffocated. When hunger was not a fear, but a fact. These were the winters spoken of in hushed tones, long after they had passed. The winters that tested not just patience, but survival. The ones that carved themselves into memory like frost etches glass. Fragile, beautiful, and unrelentingly sharp. Let us return now to one such season, the winter of 1315. The year began innocently enough, with signs of a good harvest. But then came the rains. They didn't stop. Spring was wet, summer worse, crops drowned in the fields, hay rotted in barns, grain refused to dry, and when autumn came, instead of reaping abundance, Europe stood on the edge of catastrophe. Winter sealed its fate. With no surplus, no storehouses, and little fodder, animals died in droves. Fields lay empty, markets grew silent, and as the cold returned, famine set in, not just in one region, but across nations. The Great Famine of 1315-1317 claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. In some towns, 1 in 10 perished. In others, entire villages vanished. Chronicles tell of parents burying children, of neighbors fighting over crusts, of desperate acts spoken only in rumor. In one account, monks in a northern abbey record that birds vanished from the sky, and the earth gave no food. Another speaks of people digging in the frozen ground for roots, anything to quiet the gnawing inside. Grain prices soared beyond the reach of most. Bread, when found, was coarse, black, bitter. Meat was gone, fish hoarded. Even the wealthy found themselves unprepared for the sheer length and severity of the crisis. And yet, amid this suffering, people kept going, kept chopping wood even with hollow cheeks, kept milking what animals remained, kept lighting fires, singing hymns, offering scraps to the hungry. In the cathedral city of Chartres, it is said that a baker continued to hand out loaves each morning, long after his store was empty. When asked why, he said, "I know what hunger feels like. I will not let others feel it alone." He died that winter, but his name lived on, not in gold or glass, but in the warmth remembered by those he fed. These brutal winters did not only break bodies, they shaped identities. Communities learned how to adapt, how to stretch little into enough. New preservation methods emerged. People turned to nuts, acorns, pine bark, processed and boiled into edible paste. Others dried moss or scraped lichen from rocks. Healers experimented. Faith deepened, and children learned early that life was fragile and also fiercely precious. In some towns, annual winter feasts shifted, not celebrations of excess, but of survival. People gathered not to indulge, but to acknowledge, "We are still here." That phrase, repeated year after year, became a kind of prayer, a vow. We are still here, still lighting fires, still baking bread, still singing in the dark. And though the harshest winters eventually passed, they left behind new habits, new understandings. Windows were shuttered tighter, root cellars dug deeper, villages built stronger granaries, and laws were passed to keep markets honest. Local leaders organized mutual aid. Churches stocked alms with more seriousness. Famine was no longer a distant fear. It had a face and a memory. Even art shifted. In manuscripts, we see more images of winter not as peaceful snowfalls, but as skeletal trees, gaunt figures, children bundled against vast white skies. Songs changed too, minor keys, haunting refrains, melodies built on endurance rather than joy. But the human spirit, quiet, stubborn, endlessly adapting, carried on. That same spirit lives in us now. In the way we prepare before storms, in the way we light candles during blackouts, in the way we bring soup to a sick friend, or check on an elderly neighbor, or offer a warm coat without being asked. We inherit more than history, we inherit response. And so when modern winters arrive, with their own kind of silence, their own kind of isolation, we are not empty-handed. We carry the memory of those who came before, not always in words, but in instinct, to soften, to share, to endure. Even if we do not face famine or plague, even if our hardships are different, we still face seasons when the world feels cold, and we still return to the same tools: warmth, patience, each other. The winters of the past were not survived alone, and neither are ours. So as this story nears its end, hold that truth close, that endurance is never a solitary act. It's a chain stretching across centuries, from firekeeper to firekeeper, from bread baker to bread sharer, from song to song, and it continues even now. And now, as the final embers of this story glow softly in the dark, we reach the quiet end, not of winter itself, but of our shared journey through it. You've listened to the wind rustle through medieval thatch. You've walked the muddy lanes, stepped into frostbitten chapels, crouched beside smoking hearths. You've felt the cold as they felt it, not just on skin, but in the bones of daily life. You've sat beside the hungry, wept with the grieving, whispered prayers into the long, long night. And most of all, you've seen how people endured. Not just survived, but endured. There is a difference. Survival is a reaction. Endurance is a decision. To rise when the world is hard. To give when there's barely enough. To sing not because the season is kind, but because silence must be broken. And the people of the medieval winter, those quiet, calloused souls, understood this deeply. They may not have had our science, or our medicine, or our technologies, but they had one another, and they had memory. Memory of the last winter, the last famine, the last thaw. That memory guided their hands, when to sow, when to store, when to fast, when to feast. And memory guides us too, when we gather during storms, when we light candles in December, when we cook family recipes in a familiar pot, when we instinctively bring out extra blankets, or sit a little closer during cold nights. These are not random habits. They are inherited instincts, stories passed not through words, but through actions, gestures, rhythms. And in telling this story tonight, in walking through these frozen landscapes, you've joined that chain. You've kept a memory alive. And that matters, because though we no longer fear the same winters, though our walls are thicker, our fires hotter, our shelves fuller, we still face our own seasons of hardship, loneliness, exhaustion, uncertainty. There are winters of the heart just as harsh as any January, and in those moments we need stories like this. Not because they offer escape, but because they offer echo, a reminder that what we feel now has been felt before, and endured, and emerged from. When the frost was deepest, the people of the past did not stop. They sowed, they prayed, they mended, they loved, they waited for the light to return. And it did. It always did. So tonight, in your own quiet space, I hope this story has wrapped around you like a quilt, that it has reminded you not only of history, but of your own strength, your own warmth. You are part of a long tradition of firekeepers, carriers of memory. You hold the wisdom of many winters. Let that be your comfort. Let that be your rest. And when the night feels long, when the cold creeps close, remember, you are not alone in the dark. There are voices beside you, Ancient, gentle, steady. They hum lullabies, they stir stew, they open doors and let in strangers, they whisper from across the centuries, we made it through. So will you. Sleep well, kind soul. Winter is long, but your light is longer.